Husband got jealous when his wife smiled at a Hell's Angel, but the truth made him fall to his knees. The chrome on the Harley caught the last light of day as Reed watched his wife's face change, not the way it changed when she looked at him anymore, but the way it used to, back when they were young and the world was still full of things that hadn't been lost yet. Across the diner parking lot, the man in the leather vest turned, and Maya's smile broke open like sunrise after years of rain. Reed felt his chest cave in, felt the jealousy rise hot and poisonous, felt himself become smaller in a moment that should have made him demand answers. But he said nothing. He just watched the Hell's Angel walk toward them, boots heavy on gravel, and felt the foundation of everything he thought he knew begin to crack. Wait, before the next ride begins. If this story already hit you right in the chest, tell us where you're watching from. To ride with the Brotherhood through the next promise, loss, or redemption, subscribe and join the club. Engines up, back to the road. Reed Hartley had stopped noticing the small things about his wife somewhere around year 7 of their marriage. Not the big things. He still loved her, still came home, still said the words, even when they felt like stones in his mouth. But the small things, the true things, those had faded like paint on a road sign left too long in the sun. He noticed now. They'd pulled into the Copper Ridge Diner just after 6, the Subaru's engine ticking as it cooled, the air inside still thick with the silence that had followed them from Phoenix. 2 weeks on the road, supposedly reconnecting, supposedly finding whatever it was they'd lost, somewhere between the mortgage and the miscarriage and the quiet, creeping realization that they'd become strangers who shared a bed. Maya had been staring out the window when the motorcycles rolled in. 3 of them, engines rumbling like distant thunder, chrome flashing in the amber light. Reed had tensed automatically, the way civilians do when they see the patch, the skull, the bottom rocker that says Arizona. Hell's Angels. He'd started to suggest they eat somewhere else, started to reach for the keys, but Maya's hand had stopped him. Not grabbed his wrist, just touched it, light as a moth, and he'd looked over to see her face transformed. That was when the jealousy hit. Because his wife was smiling at one of those bikers the way she hadn't smiled at Reed in 3 years. The way she used to smile at old photographs when she thought he wasn't looking. The way people smile at ghosts they'd given up on ever seeing again. The biker had stopped mid-stride, leather vest creaking, and Reed watched the man's face cycle through surprise, then something like pain, then something Reed couldn't name. The man was maybe 55, 60, built like someone who'd done hard labor and harder living, with gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. His hands were scarred. His eyes were the kind that had seen things that left marks. Maya was out of the car before Reed could process it, moving faster than he'd seen her move in years. And the biker was walking toward her with the same strange urgency. They met in the middle of the parking lot, under the flickering neon that said, "Open 24 hours." And Reed watched his wife embrace this stranger with both arms, watched her shake with something that might have been laughter or might have been sobs. The other 2 bikers, one with a red beard down to his chest, the other lean and watchful with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stayed by their bikes but were watching, not threatening. Witnessing. Reed got out of the car slowly, feeling like he was moving through water, like the world had shifted into a frequency he couldn't quite hear. The jealousy was still there, hot and ugly in his gut, but something else was rising alongside it. Confusion, fear, the terrible sense that he was about to learn something that would change the shape of everything. "Maya," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. She pulled back from the biker, and Reed saw tears on her face, bright and unashamed. The biker's eyes were wet too, though his face was carved from harder stone. "Reed," Maya said, and her voice was steadier than it had been in months. "This is Trace Brennan." The name meant nothing to Reed. He waited. Maya looked at the biker, then back at Reed, and something passed between them, between her and Trace, some silent conversation that excluded Reed entirely. It made the jealousy flare hotter. "I need to tell you something," Maya said, and her hand was still on the biker's arm, familiar, comfortable, in a way that made Reed want to shout. "I should have told you a long time ago." The diner's parking lot seemed to grow larger, emptier. One of the other bikers, the one with the scar, lit a cigarette, the flame bright in the gathering dusk. "Then tell me," Reed said, and heard the edge in his own voice, the anger he'd been swallowing for years starting to leak through. Maya took a breath. "Trace is my brother." The words didn't land right. Reed heard them, processed them, but they didn't make sense. Maya was an only child. She'd told him that when they first met, told him about her lonely childhood, her distant parents, the way she'd grown up feeling like she was the only person in an empty house. "You don't have a brother," Reed said. "Yes, she does," Trace said, and his voice was gravel and smoke and something that might have been old grief. "She just hasn't seen me in 23 years. The diner was nearly empty. Just a waitress who looked like she'd seen everything twice and stopped being surprised the first time around, and an old man nursing coffee in a corner booth. They took a table by the window, and Reed sat across from Maya and Trace, feeling like he'd walked into a movie that had started without him. The other two bikers came in after a moment, took a table across the room, giving space but staying close. That was how they moved, Reed was starting to realize, like a pack, like people who'd learned to trust the ones beside them because there was no one else. "Start from the beginning," Reed said, looking at his wife. Maya's hands were wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't touched. "I lied to you," she said simply. "Not about everything, but about this, about where I came from, about who I was before I met you." "Maya," Trace started, but she shook her head. "No, I have to say it." She looked at Reed, and her eyes were clear for the first time in months. "My real name is Maya Brennan. I grew up in Flagstaff. My father was David Brennan. Maybe you've heard of him. He was a Hells Angel, one of the founding members of the Arizona Charter." Reed hadn't heard of him. His world and that world had never touched. "I had a brother," Maya continued, "Trace. He's 6 years older than me. When I was 16 and he was 22, something happened. Something bad." Trace's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "Our father had enemies," Maya said. "Not just rivals in other clubs, real enemies. People who wanted him dead, wanted the club destroyed. And one night, they came for us. Came to our house while Dad was on a run, while it was just me and Mom and Trace." The diner felt smaller suddenly. The waitress was refilling the old man's coffee, moving slow, and Reed realized she was listening too, the way small-town people do when a story starts to unfold. "Trace saved my life," Maya said. "There were 3 of them. They had guns. Trace didn't, but he fought them anyway. Gave Mom time to get me out, get me hidden. By the time it was over, 2 of them were dead. Trace was in the hospital for 2 months. "Jesus," Reed breathed. "The third man got away," Trace said quietly. "And he told the cops I'd started it, told them I was dealing for the club, that the men who came were buyers, that it was a deal gone bad." "It wasn't true," Maya said quickly. "None of it was true. But the prosecutor wanted to make an example, wanted to break the club. Trace was 22, already had the patch, already had a record from a bar fight when he was 19. They offered him a deal, testify against Dad, against the club, walk away with probation, or keep quiet and do 25 years. Reed looked at Trace. The biker was staring at his own hands, scarred and thick, hands that had held a weapon, held a dying man, held silence for 23 years. I kept quiet, Trace said. Did 17 years before parole. Got out 4 years ago. And you never told me? Reed said to Maya, hearing the hurt in his own voice, unable to hide it. I was 17 when it happened, Maya said. Mom moved us to California right after, changed our names. She couldn't handle the club life anymore, couldn't handle what it had cost us. She made me promise I'd leave it all behind, make a new life, be someone different. She said if I held on to it, it would drown me the way it drowned her. She died 2 years after we moved, Maya continued, and her voice cracked. Heart attack. But really, I think she just couldn't carry it anymore. All that grief, all that anger at a world that took her son and left her with nothing but a daughter who looked at her like she'd made the wrong choice. Trace's hand moved across the table, covered Maya's. It was a simple gesture, but it held weight. Years of weight. Decades of silence. I tried to find you, Maya said to her brother, after Mom died, but you were still inside, and the system wouldn't let me visit. Said I wasn't on your approved list. I wrote letters, dozens of letters. Did you ever? I got them, Trace said. His voice was rough. Every one. I just couldn't write back. I couldn't drag you back into that world. You were out. You were clean. You had a chance. I wasn't out, Maya said, and tears were sliding down her face now, silent and unstoppable. I was lost. I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. I built this whole life, married a good man. She looked at Reed, tried to be the person Mom wanted me to be. But I was never whole, because half of me was still back there, still 17, still wondering if my brother hated me for not fighting harder to see him. I could never hate you, Trace said, and his voice broke. You were the only thing that kept me breathing in there. Knowing you were out, knowing you were safe, knowing you got away from all of it, that's what got me through. Reed felt something shifting in his chest, felt the jealousy transforming into something else. Not shame, not quite, but close. He'd thought he'd known his wife, thought he'd known her loneliness, her silence, her sadness. He'd thought it was about him, about their marriage, about the baby they'd lost and the distance that had grown between them. But it wasn't about him at all. It was about a brother she'd lost when she was 17, a family that had been torn apart by violence and lies, and a justice system that didn't care about truth, only about closing cases. It was about a girl who'd been told to forget, to move on, to become someone new, and had spent 23 years trying to suffocate the person she really was. Why didn't you tell me? Reed asked quietly. Maya looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the answer before she spoke it. Because I was afraid, she said. Afraid you'd see me differently. Afraid you'd think I was lying about everything. Afraid you'd leave. I wouldn't have left, Reed said. You say that now, Maya replied. But back then, when we first met, I was working at that bookstore, going to community college, trying to be normal. If I'd told you my father was a Hell's Angel, my brother was in prison for killing 2 men, my real name was something else, would you have stayed? Would you have believed me? Reed wanted to say yes, wanted to believe he was the kind of man who would have seen past the history, the violence, the weight of it all. But he was honest enough to admit he didn't know. He'd been 25, fresh out of college, working his first real job. He'd thought he wanted adventure, but really, he'd wanted safety, comfort, a life that made sense. I don't know, he admitted. Maya nodded slowly. That's why I didn't tell you. The waitress appeared then, refilled their coffee, left a slice of pie neither of them had ordered, a peace offering, a small-town kindness. So what now? Reed asked, looking between his wife and the brother she'd just reclaimed. Trace spoke before Maya could. Now, nothing. I didn't come here looking for her. Didn't even know she was in Arizona. This was pure chance. We're passing through on our way to a memorial run in Tucson. Brother from the club passed last month, and we're riding for him." "But now you found each other," Reed said. "Yeah," Trace said. "Now we have." "And you're just going to ride away again?" Reed asked. "After 23 years?" Trace looked at Maya, a question in his eyes. "No," Maya said quietly. "No, you're not." They talked until the diner closed at midnight, until the waitress finally gave up pretending she wasn't listening and just pulled up a chair at the next table over. They talked about Flagstaff, about the club, about the father Maya barely remembered, and Trace had spent 17 years trying to forget. They talked about prison, about the men Trace had met inside, about the day he'd gotten his release papers and walked out into a world that had moved on without him. They talked about the club, the real club, not the mythology Reed had built in his head from movies and news reports. Trace told them about the brotherhood, about the men who'd waited for him when he got out, who'd given him a job at a custom shop in Tucson, who'd made sure he had a place to land. He told them about the memorial runs, the charity rides, the way the club took care of its own and the families left behind. "It's not perfect," Trace said. "We've got our share of criminals, our share of men who make bad choices. But it's also family, real family, the kind that doesn't leave you when things get hard." Maya had been quiet during this part, listening, and Reed watched her face, saw the hunger there, the longing for something she'd been denied her whole adult life. "I want you to meet them," Trace said finally. "The brothers. I want them to know you're alive, that you're real. Dad's old crew, they ask about you sometimes. Wonder what happened to Little Bird." "Little Bird," Maya repeated, and smiled through tears. "God, I haven't heard that in so long." "That was your road name," Trace said. "Dad gave it to you when you were 5, after you climbed up on his bike and told him you were going to fly." Reed felt like he was watching his wife remember how to be someone she'd forgotten. And part of him, the small, selfish part, was afraid of what that might mean for them. But the larger part, the part that had married Maya because he loved her, not because he owned her, knew that this was necessary. That his wife had been drowning slowly for years, and he'd been standing on the shore wondering why she wouldn't swim to him, never realizing she'd been weighed down by chains he couldn't see. "Okay," Reed said, surprising himself. "Okay, what?" "Okay, we'll go with you to Tucson, to the memorial run, if that's what you want." "Reed, you don't have to." "I want to," Reed said, and meant it. "I want to meet your family, your real family. I want to understand where you come from." Trace studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Reed Hartley." "Better than I gave you credit for when I first saw you standing there looking like you wanted to put a fist through my face." Reed felt his ears burn. I know what you thought," Trace said, not unkindly. "I saw it on your face. Saw the way you looked at Maya looking at me. Can't blame you for that. But you should know, my sister's the strongest person I've ever met. She survived things that would have broken most people. She built a life out of nothing, out of grief and silence. If she chose you, it's because she saw something worth holding on to." Maya was crying again, quiet tears that slid down her face and dripped onto the table. "I'm sorry," she said to Reed. "I'm so sorry I didn't tell you. I'm sorry I made you think you weren't enough, that you were the reason I was sad. You were never the problem. You were the one good thing I managed to hold on to when everything else was falling apart." Reed reached across the table, took his wife's hand. It was the first time they'd touched with intention in weeks. "We're going to be okay," he said, and surprised himself by believing it. They followed the motorcycles out of Copper Ridge at dawn, Reed driving, Maya in the passenger seat with her hand on the window like she could touch the wind if she tried hard enough. The 2 other bikers, Mason with the red beard and Hawk with the scar, rode flanks while Trace led. They moved like they'd been riding together for decades, which Reed supposed they had. The road to Tucson was long and straight, cutting through desert that seemed to go on forever. Maya was quiet at first, then started to talk, really talk, in a way she hadn't in years. She told Reed about growing up in the clubhouse, about the parties that lasted all weekend, about the women who'd taught her to be tough and the men who'd taught her to ride. She told him about her father, David Brennan, who'd been hard and distant but had loved her in his way, through protection, through provision, through the patch he wore that said he'd die before he'd let harm come to his family. She told him about the night everything changed, about hearing the glass break, about her mother's scream, about Trace shouting for her to run. She told him about hiding in the crawl space under the house, listening to the sounds of men fighting, of bones breaking, of her brother keeping a promise he'd never spoken out loud. "I didn't understand it then," Maya said. "Didn't understand why Trace wouldn't just tell the truth, wouldn't save himself. But I understand now. He was protecting the club, protecting Dad's legacy. If he testified, the prosecutor would have used it to tear everything apart. Every brother would have been investigated, every business, every family. Trace took the weight so everyone else could walk free." "That's a hell of a sacrifice," Reed said. "That's what it means to wear the patch," Maya replied. "You put the club first, always." Reed thought about that, about the way his own life had been built on smaller, safer choices, about the way he'd chosen comfort over risk, security over passion, the known over the unknown. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Leaving that world? Becoming someone else?" Maya was quiet for a long time, long enough that Reed thought she might not answer. "I regret the lie," she said finally. "I regret letting Mom convince me that I had to choose between who I was and who I could become. But I don't regret building a life with you. I don't regret the years we've had, even the hard ones. I just wish I'd trusted you enough to tell you the truth." "You can trust me now," Reed said. "I know," Maya said. "I'm starting to see that." They stopped for gas in a town called Red Mesa, and while Reed pumped, the three bikers gathered near their machines. Reed watched them through the window. Trace talking, Mason nodding, Hawk scanning the horizon like he was reading weather that hadn't arrived yet. They moved with a kind of purpose Reed had never had, like they knew exactly who they were and what they stood for. Maya came back from the bathroom with coffee for both of them, and they stood together watching the bikers. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking I don't know if I could do what Trace did," Reed admitted. "Take 17 years for something I didn't do. Give up that much of my life." "You'd be surprised what you'd do for family," Maya said, "for the people you love." When they got back on the road, Reed found himself thinking about that, about family, about the ways people protected each other, the ways they lied and sacrificed and endured. He thought about his own family, his parents in Oregon, distant and polite, the kind of people who sent Christmas cards with photos of their grandchildren but never called just to talk. He thought about the way he'd learned to love from them, which was to say carefully, conditionally, with one foot always out the door. Maybe that was why he'd failed to see his wife drowning, because he'd been taught to love from a distance, to protect himself first. But Trace had loved Maya by going to prison, by keeping silent, by carrying weight that should have been shared. Reed didn't know if he was capable of that kind of love, but he wanted to be. Tucson rose out of the desert like a promise, all adobe and saguaro and sky so blue it hurt to look at. They followed the bikes to a compound on the east side, a sprawling property with a clubhouse at its center, bikes lined up like soldiers, and a crowd of leather and chrome and weathered faces. Reed had never been around this many Hell's Angels at once. The patch was everywhere, on backs, on walls, on flags snapping in the hot wind. He felt out of place in his button-down and khakis, felt like an anthropologist who'd stumbled into a ceremony he wasn't meant to witness. But Trace led them through the crowd with Maya at his side, and Reed followed, watching the way people reacted when they saw her. The double takes, the whispers, then the recognition. "Little bird?" an older man said, stopping mid-stride. He had white hair pulled back in a braid, a beard down to his chest, and eyes that had seen decades of road. "Jesus Christ, is that really you?" Maya nodded, and the man pulled her into a hug that lifted her off her feet. "We thought you were gone," he said, voice rough. "Thought we'd lost you for good." "I was gone," Maya said, "but I'm back now." Others gathered then, men and women who'd known her as a child, who'd known her father, who'd watched Trace go to prison and wondered what had happened to the little girl he'd saved. They touched her gently, like she might break, like she was something precious they'd been given back after years of loss. Reed stood to the side, watching, feeling the weight of history he hadn't been part of, feeling small in the face of connections this deep. A woman approached him, maybe 60, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She wore leather and denim and a knowing smile. "You're the husband," she said. "Reed," he replied. "Kendra," she said. "I was David Brennan's old lady for 10 years before he passed, which makes me something like Maya's stepmother, though we never use those words." "He passed," Reed said, surprised. 5 years ago," Kendra said. "Heart attack on a run through Colorado. Died on his bike, which is how he would have wanted it. Trace couldn't come to the funeral, was still on parole, couldn't leave the state. But he called me after, and I could hear it in his voice. He'd lost the only father he'd known, and he'd had to grieve alone." Reed looked across the yard to where Trace was standing with Maya, introducing her to younger members who'd never known her father. "He never stopped protecting her," Kendra said, following Reed's gaze. "Even from inside. He made sure she stayed away, stayed clean, made sure the club knew she was off limits, that no one was to look for her or drag her back into this life. He gave her the freedom to be whoever she wanted to be." "She told me tonight," Reed said, "about all of it, about Trace, about what happened. I didn't know. She never said." "People carry their ghosts the way they can," Kendra said. "Maya carried hers by trying to pretend they didn't exist. Can't say I blame her. This life," she gestured at the compound, the bikes, the men and women gathered in the fading light, "it's not for everyone. It's hard. It's dangerous. It costs more than most people can pay. But it's family," Reed said. "Yeah," Kendra said, smiling. "It's family. Real, messy, complicated family. The kind that doesn't leave you even when you wish they would." A bell rang then, clear and loud, and the crowd began to move toward the clubhouse. Reed followed, staying close to Maya, feeling like a satellite orbiting a world he was only beginning to understand. Inside, the clubhouse was dim and cool, full of photos and patches and memories that lined the walls like saints in a cathedral. At the front of the room stood a single photograph, a man in his 70s, gray-haired and smiling, patch visible on his chest. "That's Bishop," Trace said quietly, appearing at Reed's shoulder. "The man we're riding for. He was in the club for 51 years. Started when he was 19, right after he came back from Vietnam. He was there the night I took the weight, told me I was doing the right thing, promised me the club would be there when I got out." "Was he?" Reed asked. "He visited me every month for 17 years, Trace said. Never missed once. Brought news from the outside. Reminded me I wasn't forgotten." "When I got out, he was the first person waiting at the gate. The ceremony was simple but profound. One by one, members stood and shared memories of Bishop, stories of rides and fights and laughs, of mistakes made and forgiven, of the way he'd shown up when people needed him most. There was no preacher, no formal structure, just people remembering someone who'd mattered. When Trace stood, the room fell silent. Bishop saved my life, Trace said. Not the dramatic way. He never pulled me from a burning building or took a bullet for me, but the slow way, the hard way. He showed up when I had nothing, when I was just a number in a cell, and he reminded me I was still human, still a brother, still worth something. His voice cracked. He told me once that the club wasn't about the bikes or the parties or the reputation. It was about having people who'd ride into the dark for you, who'd hold your secrets, who'd carry you when you couldn't stand. He said that's what made it sacred. That's what made it worth protecting. Trace looked at Maya then, and Reed saw tears on both their faces. "My sister's here tonight," Trace said. "The one I thought I'd lost. The one I kept away for 23 years because I loved her too much to let her get hurt. And I want to thank Bishop for teaching me what that kind of love looks like, for showing me that sometimes protecting someone means letting them go, and sometimes it means being ready for the day they come back." The room erupted in a rumble of approval, knuckles on tables, voices raised in agreement. It wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement, witnessing. Maya stood and walked to her brother, and they held each other while the club watched. These men and women who understood that family wasn't about blood alone, but about choices, about showing up, about staying. Reed felt something break open in his chest, felt the jealousy dissolve, felt the fear transform into something else. Not understanding, not yet, but beginning. The memorial ride happened at dawn. 30 bikes rolling out of Tucson in formation, Trace and Maya leading. Reed rode in a support vehicle with Kendra and 2 other club members who'd aged out of riding, and he watched through the window as the pack moved like a single organism, chrome flashing, engines harmonizing. They rode to a spot in the desert Bishop had loved, a place where the saguaros grew thick and ancient, and the silence was absolute. They scattered his ashes there while the sun rose, each member saying something quiet and personal, a goodbye that was also a promise to remember. Maya scattered ashes too, though she'd never met Bishop. She did it for Trace, Reed realized. Did it because this was his family, which made it hers again, which made it something she needed to honor. On the ride back, Reed drove behind the pack, watching his wife ride on the back of Trace's bike with her arms around her brother's waist and her face turned toward the sun. She looked free in a way he'd never seen her look, like she'd been holding her breath for 23 years and had finally been given permission to exhale. When they got back to the compound, there was food and beer and stories that lasted into the afternoon. Reed sat with the older members, listening to them talk about the early days, about Bishop and David Brennan and the wild years before the world had gotten complicated. "You seem like a decent man," a biker named Colt said to Reed. He was maybe 70, with hands like hammers and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "But you're out of your depth here, aren't you?" Reed laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to everyone," Colt said kindly. "But that's not a bad thing. This world, it's not for everyone. Most people can't handle the commitment. Can't handle knowing that if you put on this patch, you're saying you'll die for the people beside you. That's heavy weight." "Maya lived in this world," Reed said. "She was born into it." "She was," Colt agreed. "And then she was taken out of it. That's a hard thing, being torn from your roots. Makes you feel like you're floating, like you don't belong anywhere." "Is that why she's been so sad?" Reed asked. "All these years?" "Can't say for certain," Colt said, "but I'd bet a decent part of it. When you grow up in the club, you grow up knowing you've got 100 people who'd come running if you called. Then that gets taken away, and suddenly you're on your own, trying to figure out how to be normal when you never learned what normal was. That's a lonely way to live." Reed thought about that. About Maya trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to fit into a world that had never quite made sense to her. About him assuming her sadness was about their marriage, about the baby they'd lost, about his failures as a husband. "I didn't see it," Reed said quietly. "I didn't see what she needed." "You see it now," Colt said. "That's what matters. The question is what you're going to do about it." Reed didn't have an answer for that yet. but he was starting to understand the question. They stayed in Tucson for 3 days. Reed called his office, took emergency leave, stopped caring about the emails piling up in his inbox. This was more important. He watched Maya reconnect with people who'd known her as a child, watched her remember stories she'd buried, watched her laugh in a way that sounded like freedom. He watched Trace hover near her protectively, not controlling, but present, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. And he watched the way the club treated her, not like a stranger, not like someone who'd left and abandoned them, but like someone who'd been stolen and had finally found her way home. They gave her space but stayed close. They asked questions but didn't push. They let her be whoever she needed to be. On the 3rd night, Maya found Reed sitting outside the clubhouse, watching the stars. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," Reed said honestly. "I'm trying to figure out what happens next." Maya sat beside him. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," Reed said, gesturing at the compound, at the bikes, at the world Maya had rediscovered. "You're different here, happier, more yourself, and I'm wondering if there's room for me in that." Maya took his hand. "Reed, I love you. That hasn't changed." "But you're not the person I thought you were," Reed said, not accusing, just stating fact. "You're Maya Brennan, little bird, the daughter of a Hell's Angel and the sister of a man who sacrificed everything for his family. You're someone who grew up in this world, who understands it in a way I never will. And I'm wondering if you've been pretending to be someone else for me all these years." "I have been," Maya admitted. "Not intentionally, not to hurt you. But yes, I've been pretending to be someone smaller, someone safer, someone who fit into the life I thought I was supposed to want." "And now?" Reed asked. "Now I don't know," Maya said. "I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to lose this, lose them, lose Trace again. I don't think I could survive that." Reed was quiet for a long time, watching the way the moonlight caught on chrome, the way the desert stretched out forever in all directions. "Then, don't," he said finally. "Don't lose them. Don't pretend to be someone you're not." "But what about us?" Maya asked, and her voice was small. "I don't know yet," Reed said. "But I know this. I married you because I loved you. Not because I wanted to own you or control you or make you into something you weren't. I married you because you were the strongest, most stubborn, most beautiful person I'd ever met. And if part of that strength comes from this world, from this family, then I need to make space for that." "You'd really do that?" Maya asked. "Even if it means our life looks different? Even if it means spending time here, with people who aren't like you, doing things you don't understand?" "I'd really do that," Reed said. "Because the alternative is watching you suffocate, and I can't do that. I won't." Maya leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just being. "I should have told you," she said eventually. "Should have trusted you enough to be honest about where I came from." "Maybe," Reed said, "but you're telling me now, and that's enough." Inside the clubhouse, someone started playing music, old country, the kind with steel guitar and heartache. People were dancing, slow and close, the kind of dancing that's more about holding on than moving. "Come on," Maya said, standing and pulling Reed to his feet. "I don't dance," Reed protested. "Everyone dances eventually," Maya said, smiling. "You just have to be brave enough to start." They went inside, and Maya led Reed to the floor, and they moved together while the club watched with knowing smiles. Reed was stiff at first, self-conscious, but Maya held him close and whispered in his ear, and eventually he relaxed into it. Let the music carry them. Let the moment be what it was. He looked up and saw Trace watching from across the room, the biker's face unreadable. Then Trace nodded just once, and Reed understood it. It was a kind of blessing, an acknowledgement that Reed was trying, and that trying was enough. On the morning they were supposed to leave, Reed woke early and found Trace sitting outside with coffee, watching the sun come up over the desert. "Mind if I join you?" Reed asked. "Free country," Trace said, but he shifted over to make room. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee, watching the sky turn from black to purple to orange. "You're a good brother," Reed said eventually. Trace looked at him. "Am I?" "You gave up 17 years of your life to protect your family," Reed said, "to protect Maya, to protect people you loved. That's not something most people could do." "Wasn't a choice," Trace said. "Not really. When you love someone, you do what needs doing." The rest is just details. "Maya loves you," Reed said. "In case you were wondering, she's loved you for 23 years, even when she thought she'd never see you again." "I know," Trace said. "I could see it on her face that first night. Could see all the years in her eyes." "I'm not going to take her away from you," Reed said. "Just so we're clear, I'm not going to make her choose between this life and the one we built. If she wants to be part of this world again, I'm going to figure out how to support that." Trace studied him for a long moment. "You really mean that?" "I do," Reed said. "I don't understand it all yet. Don't understand the club, the culture, the code you all live by. But I understand that it matters to Maya, which means it matters to me. You're going to have to learn," Trace said. "If you want to be part of her life, her real life, you're going to have to learn what it means to be family. Not the easy kind, the hard kind, the kind that costs something." "I'm ready to learn," Reed said. "We'll see," Trace said. But he was smiling. Most civilians don't make it. They think they can handle it, think they can deal with the lifestyle, the reputation, the way people look at you when they see the patch. But then it gets real, and they run. "I'm not most civilians," Reed said. "No," Trace agreed. "I don't think you are." They finished their coffee as the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert gold. "There's a thing happening next month," Trace said carefully. "A run. We ride from here to San Diego. Stop at every charter along the way. It's tradition, something we do every year. Maya used to come when she was a kid. She loved it. You want her to come this year?" Reed said. "I want you both to come," Trace said. "If you're serious about learning, about being part of this, then come. See what it really looks like. Not just a memorial or a reunion, but the day-to-day reality of what we are." Reed thought about his job, his responsibilities, the life he'd built that suddenly seemed very small and very far away. "Okay," he said. "Well, come." Trace nodded slowly. "All right then, I'll hold you to that." When they finally left Tucson, Reed driving and Maya in the passenger seat, they were different people than they'd been when they arrived. Not worse or better, just more honest. Maya cried as they pulled away, watching Trace and the other bikers grow smaller in the rearview mirror, but she was also smiling. "Thank you," she said to Reed after they'd been on the road for an hour. "For what?" "For not making me choose," she said. "For giving me permission to be whole again." "You don't need my permission," Reed said. "You never did." "Maybe not," Maya said. "But it helps, having you with me, knowing you're trying to understand." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the road stretching out before them, endless and full of possibility. "Reed," Maya said eventually. "Yeah?" "That night at the diner, when you first saw me with Trace, you were jealous." Reed felt his face heat. "I was." "I could see it on your face," Maya said, "the way you looked at us, like you thought I was going to leave you for him." "I didn't know who he was," Reed said quietly. "All I knew was that you were smiling at him the way you used to smile at me, before everything got hard, and it scared me." "I'm sorry I scared you," Maya said, "but I'm also glad." "Glad?" "It meant you still cared enough to be jealous," Maya said. "It meant I still mattered to you. I'd started to think I didn't." "You always mattered," Reed said. "I just didn't know how to show you, didn't know what you needed." "You're learning," Maya said, and squeezed his hand. They stopped for the night in a town called Desert Springs, got a motel room that smelled like dust and old carpet. They made love that night for the first time in months, and it was different than it had been. Slower, more intentional, more honest. Like they were relearning each other. Like they were starting over. Afterward, lying in the dark with Maya's head on his chest, Reed said, "Tell me more. About when you were a kid, about your father, about what it was really like." And Maya did. She told him stories until her voice went hoarse, until the sky outside the window began to lighten, until they both fell asleep tangled together, dreaming of roads they'd never ridden and families they were still learning to understand. The next month passed in a blur of normalcy that felt surreal. Reed went back to work, Maya went back to her job at the library, and they fell into the rhythms of their old life. But something fundamental had shifted. Maya started calling Trace every few days, long conversations that lasted hours. She started looking at old photos she'd kept hidden for years, started talking about Flagstaff and her father and the memories she'd spent decades trying to bury. And Reed listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't in years. He also started doing research, reading about motorcycle clubs, about the history of the Hells Angels, about the culture and code and complicated reality of a world he'd only known through stereotypes. He learned that it wasn't simple, wasn't just outlaws and crime and violence. It was also loyalty and structure and a kind of family that didn't exist in the civilian world. He learned that Trace's sacrifice, 17 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, wasn't unusual. That many men had done similar things, had taken weight for the club, had protected the brotherhood at the cost of their own freedom. He learned that Maya's father, David Brennan, was a complicated man, hard and distant, but also principled, a man who'd built something lasting, even if it had come at tremendous personal cost. And he learned that the world was bigger and stranger and more nuanced than had ever imagined. When the time came for the San Diego run, Reed took 2 weeks off work without asking permission, just told his boss he needed time and would deal with the consequences when he got back. Maya quit her library job entirely, said she was done pretending to be someone who shelved books and kept her voice down when all she really wanted was wind and chrome and the road stretching out forever. They met Trace in Tucson again, but this time Reed arrived differently, not as an observer, not as Maya's nervous husband, but as someone ready to learn. The run was everything Trace had promised and more. 30 bikers rolling through Arizona, stopping at every charter, sharing meals and stories and the kind of casual intimacy that comes from spending years on the road together. Reed rode in the support vehicle again, but this time he helped with logistics, helped set up camp, helped cook meals over open fires while the bikers shared stories about runs from decades past. He watched Maya transform, watched her remember how to be Little Bird, how to laugh without holding back, how to move through the world with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she came from. And he watched Trace watch his sister, saw the way the biker's face softened every time Maya smiled, saw the weight lift from shoulders that had carried it for 17 years. On the third night, camped somewhere in the desert between Yuma and San Diego, Kendra pulled Reed aside. "You're doing good," she said. "I'm trying," Reed replied. "No, you're doing good," Kendra insisted. "Most men in your position would have run by now, would have decided this was too much, too complicated, too different from what they signed up for. But you're still here. You're still trying to understand." "Maya's worth it," Reed said simply. "She is," Kendra agreed. "But so are you. Don't forget that." Don't lose yourself trying to fit into her world. Find a way to be you and let her be her, and see if there's space in the middle for both of you. That night, Reed and Maya walked out into the desert together, away from the camp, away from the voices and the fire and the easy laughter. They walked until the stars were the only light, until the silence was absolute. "I'm scared," Maya said suddenly. "Of what?" "That I'm going to want this more than I want our life," she said. That I'm going to wake up one day and realize I've been living a lie for 12 years and that I can't go back to it. Reed took her hand. Then, don't go back to it. Build something new. But what about you? Maya asked. What about the life we built together? What about it? Reed said. Lives change. People change. We're not the same people we were when we met. We're not even the same people we were a month ago. But that doesn't mean what we have isn't real. It just means we have to figure out what it looks like now. And if I want to spend more time with Trace, Maya asked, with the club, if I want to go on runs, come to events, be part of this world again? Then we figure out how to make that work, Reed said. Maybe I come with you sometimes. Maybe I don't. Maybe we build a life that has space for both worlds. I don't know yet. But I know I don't want to lose you. And I know you can't keep living a half-life, pretending to be someone you're not. Maya pulled him close, held him tight. I love you, she said. Even if I haven't been good at showing it, even if I've been lost and sad and distant, I love you. I know, Reed said. And I love you too. All of you, even the parts I'm still learning about. They stood there in the desert, holding each other while the stars wheeled overhead, and Reed felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, not answers, but acceptance. The understanding that love wasn't about knowing everything or controlling anything. It was about showing up, about staying, about being willing to be changed by the person you loved. The run ended in San Diego, at a charter house right on the beach. They had a party that lasted 2 days, food and beer and music, and the kind of easy joy that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. On the last night, Trace found Reed standing at the water's edge, watching the waves roll in. "You made it," Trace said. "I did," Reed agreed. "Thought about running?" "Every day," Reed admitted. "But I didn't." "Why not?" Reed thought about that. "Because Maya's my wife, and I took vows. And those vows weren't conditional. They weren't, I love you as long as you stay the person I think you are. They were, I love you. Period. Full stop. Even when it's hard. Even when I don't understand. Even when I'm scared." Trace nodded slowly. "You're all right, Reed Hartley. Better than all right. You're the kind of man I'd ride with." Coming from Trace, Reed understood that was the highest compliment he could receive. "Thank you," Reed said, "for not making this harder than it had to be, for not trying to take Maya away from me." "I'd never do that," Trace said. "She chose you. That means something. And honestly, I'm glad she has you. Glad she has someone who's trying to understand, who's not running away just because things got complicated. She deserves that." They stood together watching the ocean, two men from different worlds learning to exist in the space between. "So, what happens now?" Reed asked. "Now we ride home," Trace said. "And then we see. See if you meant what you said about being part of this. See if Maya figures out what she wants. See if there's a way to build something that honors all of who she is." "And if there isn't?" Reed asked. "Then we deal with that when it comes," Trace said. "But I think there is. I think you two are stronger than you know." The next morning, they rode out at dawn, 30 bikes and 1 support vehicle rolling north along the coast. Reed drove with the window down, tasting salt and freedom, and watched his wife ride behind her brother with her arms open to the wind. She looked like she was flying. 6 months later, Reed and Maya were still figuring it out, but figuring it out together. They'd moved from Phoenix to Tucson, found a house halfway between their old life and Maya's new one. Reed had taken a job that let him work remotely 3 days a week, and Maya had started working at the custom shop where Trace did fabrication, learning to paint bikes with the kind of artistry that made people stop and stare. They went on runs once a month. Reed had even started riding his own bike, a used Harley that Trace had helped him restore, teaching him about engines and chrome and the way a machine could become an extension of yourself if you treated it right. They weren't perfect. They still fought sometimes, still had nights where the distance between them felt insurmountable, but they were honest now, really honest, about what they wanted, what they needed, what scared them. And slowly, over months of trying and failing and trying again, they were building something new. Not the life they'd had before, not the life either of them had imagined, but something true. On a Saturday afternoon in December, Reed was in the garage working on his bike when he heard the rumble of engines. He looked up to see Trace pulling in with 3 other bikers, all of them grinning. "Need another set of hands?" Trace called. "Always," Reed replied. They worked together for hours, adjusting valves and checking spark plugs and talking about nothing and everything. Maya came out eventually, with beer and sandwiches, sat on the workbench with grease on her hands and light in her eyes. This, Reed thought, was what family looked like. Not the sanitized version he'd grown up with, not the distant politeness he thought was normal, but this, people showing up, people working together, people choosing to stay even when it was hard. Later, after the others had left and Reed and Maya were cleaning up, she said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me," Maya said. "For being brave enough to let me be who I really am." "You make it sound like I had a choice," Reed said, smiling. "You did," Maya said. "You could have walked away, could have decided this was too much, too complicated, but you didn't. You stayed, and that means everything." Reed pulled her close, kissed her forehead. "Where else would I go?" That night, lying in bed with Maya curled against him, Reed thought about the moment in that diner parking lot 6 months ago. Thought about watching his wife smile at a stranger, feeling the jealousy rise, feeling like his world was ending. He'd been right about one thing. His world had ended that night. The small, safe world he'd built on assumptions and ignorance, and the belief that love meant keeping someone small enough to understand. But something better had grown in its place, something messier and harder and infinitely more real. He'd learned that love wasn't about control. It was about trust, about giving someone space to be fully themselves, and being brave enough to stay beside them even when they became someone you didn't entirely recognize. He'd learned that family wasn't just the people you were born to, or the people you chose in the traditional sense. It was the people who showed up, the people who stayed, the people who'd ride into the dark for you without asking why. And he'd learned that sometimes the thing you're most afraid of, losing the person you love, is exactly what you need to risk in order to find something worth keeping. Maya stirred beside him, murmured something in her sleep. Reed held her closer and watched the moonlight paint shadows on the ceiling, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The road ahead was long and uncertain, full of turns he couldn't see and challenges he couldn't predict. But he wasn't riding alone anymore, and that made all the difference.